Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We've come a long way down the road toward the Pequot War. The times of threatening rhetoric and untenable demands on the part of the English toward the Pequots had come to an end. The magistrates of Massachusetts Bay had moved away from talking to the Pequots. First, they tried to employ scare and intimidation tactics. Then they made a play for non-Pequot native support. Their primary focus was the Narragansetts, another regional powerhouse that also happened to be traditional enemies of the Pequot. That endeavor had paid off. The Pequots were not just working on diplomacy, they were taking action. And we closed last time in part with this, quote, "The English had secured a major ally. They had secured the geography of Boston and Plymouth by virtue of the Narragansett Pledge. There were real native supporters of anyone warring with the Pequots, and they are worth developing." There was still much to come. Connecticut was on fire. The Pequots had not been spending their time on diplomacy, and they would not spend their time on diplomacy throughout the coming winter. The might of the Pequot was going to be felt by Englishmen all throughout the Connecticut settlements. Those actions are worth looking at. End quote. Both the cast of native characters and the violence that erupted in the winter of 1636 and 37 are stories that we'll continue to work through this week. Now, just one side note, as I look at that quote from last week, the Pequots did take a shot at diplomacy, if you'll remember, but the diplomatic efforts of Roger Williams had them vanquished from the Narragansett village. And it was after this, late summer, early fall, 1636, that they resorted to only violence and terror. But it had already begun. As their diplomatic envoys tried to win the support of the Narragansetts, their warriors were already busy on the Connecticut frontier. So diplomacy was one of the immediate actions taken by Saussicus when the reality of what lay ahead had sunk in, war with the English. That effort took place on the Narragansett Bay. Meanwhile, back at Saybrook, which we'll consider ground zero, Lyon Gardner had a lot of work ahead of him. Now, the term meanwhile back at Saybrook, has several applications for our time together today. It means that while all of the diplomacy was taking place, and again, you remember Roger Williams had helped to pave that way, and then his diplomacy, his efforts were continued by Edward Johnson, and then Roger Williams again intervened, and then lastly, the magistrates of Boston, led at this point still by Governor Vane, closed the deal with Miantonomo. But it can also be understood as while the Pequots were trying to garner their own support. So meanwhile, at the same time, remember, we want to understand this narrative as a series of transparencies. So we'd place the next 2 or 3 episodes right on top of the last 2, same time frame. It would not be long before the Pequots would come to understand that they would soon have to fight the English and the Narragansetts at the same time. Those are tough times. They were already facing disunity, civil war, lost leadership, plague. Imagine the psyche on these guys at this point. I mean, the situation seems like it could have been maddening. One thing they still failed to realize was that the coming war was going to be fought European style, not Algonquin. As Leo Bonfanti put it, they believed the war would consist of, quote, sporadic raids against their well-fortified villages. Both sides would suffer a few casualties, and a peace treaty would be effected when both sides found the inevitable stalemate either intolerable or boring, end quote. Based on this assessment, they made the decision to move forward with hostilities and not sue for peace. Ultimately, they would attack multiple settlements along the Connecticut River. They concentrated 300 soldiers for the harassment of Saybrook Fort alone. As I said, meanwhile, back at Saybrook. So it's against that backdrop that we can begin our narrative of the winter of 1636 and 37 with the beginning of Pequot hostilities, the siege and the Battle of Saybrook Fort. Now, this siege began in September of 1636 and would continue for the next 8 months until March of 16.